Picture this. It's late summer somewhere in ancient Alaska around 20,000 years ago, and a brown bear is standing in a river doing something that would, if observed by a modern nutritionist or anyone who has ever experienced genuine food scarcity, produce a very specific kind of existential frustration. The bear has just caught a salmon, a large, fat, calorie-dense salmon that represents a significant food item by any reasonable measure. The bear bites into the fish, eats the skin, eats the eggs, eats the brain, and then drops the rest of the carcass into the river and immediately catches another one to repeat the process. Around this bear, half-eaten salmon carcasses are piling up on the riverbank, with the casual abundance of someone who has never once worried about where the next meal is coming from. Eagles are circling, ravens are already working through the discarded fish. Small mammals are investigating the edges of the pile. The entire ecosystem downstream is about to receive a significant nutrient input from fish remains that the bear found insufficiently interesting to finish. The bear, for its part, appears to have zero feelings about any of this. An ancient human watching this scene from a safe distance is experiencing a complicated emotional response. On one hand, the bear is occupying the best fishing spot available and is approximately 500 kilograms of apex predator with unclear opinions about sharing. On the other hand, those discarded salmon carcasses represent food that the bear has essentially prepared and then abandoned, and the temptation to access that resource once the bear moves on is real and practical. The ancient human has almost certainly done exactly this before. Bears waste food in ways that benefit every other species in the ecosystem, and ancient humans were among the beneficiaries. So here's what this video is actually investigating. Why do bears waste so much food, and is it actually waste in any meaningful ecological sense? The question seems straightforward but leads somewhere considerably more interesting than it initially appears, connecting to nutrient cycling, ecological engineering, evolutionary strategy, and a reframing of what waste actually means in biological systems. Stick around because the bear eating only the best parts of 50 salmon and leaving the rest for everyone else is doing something more sophisticated ecologically than it appears to be doing nutritionally. Start with what bears are actually doing during hyperphagia, the specific physiological state they enter before hibernation, because understanding this period explains most of what looks like wasteful behavior. Hyperphagia is a seasonal phase in which bear physiology shifts toward aggressive fat accumulation in preparation for winter hibernation, with bears consuming between 12,000 and 20,000 calories per day at peak hyperphagia, roughly 8 to 10 times their normal daily caloric intake. This sounds like enormous quantity eating, which it is, but the nutritional specificity of what bears prioritize during hyperphagia is the key to understanding the selective eating that looks like waste. During salmon season specifically, bears are not eating fish because they're hungry in a simple deficit sense. They're eating fish to accumulate fat at the maximum possible rate in the minimum possible time, because the salmon run window is finite. And the fat they accumulate during it largely determines whether they'll survive hibernation and emerge in spring with sufficient reserves to reproduce successfully. This changes the optimization calculation fundamentally. A bear eating 50% of each salmon, but eating 50 salmon is accumulating fat more efficiently than a bear eating every part of each salmon, but eating fewer total salmon if the parts being left behind are lower in fat and take time to consume that could be spent catching and eating another fish. The specific parts that bears eat and leave when salmon are abundant reflect this optimization perfectly. Salmon skin is high in fat. Salmon eggs are extraordinarily calorie-dense. Salmon brain contains significant omega-3 fatty acids and other nutrients. These are the parts bears consistently eat first and most reliably consume. Salmon muscle, while nutritious and protein-rich, is lower in fat content relative to the parts bears prioritize. And, if abundant alternative salmon are available, spending time consuming every gram of muscle from a partially eaten fish has a lower return rate than dropping it and immediately catching another fish to access another set of fat-rich parts. This selective eating strategy is not stupidity or waste in any meaningful sense. It's a caloric optimization strategy calibrated specifically for the bear's physiological need to accumulate maximum fat in minimum time during a season-limited resource window. A bear that ate every part of every fish thoroughly would be applying a food scarcity optimization strategy to a temporary food abundance situation, which would actually result in lower total fat accumulation because more time would be spent processing each fish and less time would be available for catching additional ones. The apparent wastefulness is actually rational resource use when the goal is understood correctly. The ecological consequences of bear selective eating in salmon streams are among the most studied and most cited examples of apex predator effects on ecosystem nutrient dynamics, and they're worth examining in detail because they illustrate why calling this behavior waste misunderstands what's actually happening at the ecosystem level. Bears in productive salmon streams carry large numbers of salmon from the water to the forest, consuming the fat-rich parts and leaving the rest across the forest floor in a distribution pattern that fertilizes forest vegetation over significant areas around salmon streams. The nitrogen, phosphorus, and marine-derived nutrients in salmon flesh, redistributed into forest soil by bears carrying and partially consuming fish throughout the forest, are a major pathway through which marine nutrients enter terrestrial ecosystem nutrient cycles in coastal regions of the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and other areas with productive salmon runs. Trees growing near bear-active salmon streams in these regions show measurably higher growth rates than trees of the same species at equivalent distances from streams without bear activity, with the marine nitrogen signature from salmon-derived fertilization detectable in tree rings and in the nitrogen isotope ratios of forest vegetation for significant distances from the streams. This makes bears functioning as nutrient transport systems one of the more important ecological roles they play in the specific ecosystems where salmon and forest intersect. The salmon swimming upstream from the ocean are bringing marine nutrients into freshwater and terrestrial systems. Bears carrying them into the forest are distributing those nutrients across a much larger area than riverbank alone, with each discarded carcass functioning as a nutrient delivery package to a specific patch of forest floor. The forest literally grows on the leftovers of selective bear eating, making what looks like waste from a food efficiency perspective a crucial ecosystem function from a nutrient cycling perspective. Ancient humans living in coastal areas with productive salmon runs and abundant bear populations were embedded in this ecological system in ways that connected their practical resource use to the same nutrient dynamics. We've discussed across multiple earlier videos in this series how ancient humans used animal behavior as an ecological information system, and bears fishing in salmon streams provided multiple practical benefits simultaneously. The location of productive salmon streams was made obvious by bear activity. Partially consumed salmon carcasses provided supplementary food resources accessible once bears moved on, and the pattern of bear activity informed ancient hunters about salmon timing and abundance in ways useful for planning their own fishing and food storage activities. The behavior of bears around food in non-salmon contexts is worth examining separately because it shows that selective eating is not limited to fish. Bears across their range show a consistent pattern of eating the most nutritionally valuable parts of large food items and leaving the rest, a pattern that extends from salmon to ungulate prey to plant foods. A bear that kills or scavenges a large ungulate will typically eat the fat-rich organs first, the liver, heart, kidneys, and gut contents, followed by fat deposits, followed eventually by muscle depending on hunger level and other food availability. The brain and bone marrow, which are among the most fat and calorie-dense parts of any ungulate, are typically consumed before large quantities of muscle meat. This organ and fat-first eating pattern in bears mirrors the optimal foraging pattern that various researchers studying ancient human dietary patterns have proposed for early hominins approaching large carcasses, where accessing high-density nutrients in organs and fat deposits was prioritized over the larger but lower density per unit caloric content of muscle meat. Ancient humans scavenging bear-killed or bear-abandoned large ungulate carcasses would have found the most calorically valuable parts already consumed, and the bulk of the muscle mass remaining, which while less optimal than a fresh complete carcass was still significant nutritional value that ancient scavenging strategies were well adapted to utilize. Bear food caching behavior produces a different kind of apparent food waste that's worth addressing separately. Bears in some contexts, particularly grizzly bears encountering more large prey than they can consume immediately, will cache partially consumed carcasses by burying or covering them with vegetation and returning to feed on them over subsequent days. This behavior is adaptive for preserving food in the absence of refrigeration, using the insulating and somewhat antibacterial properties of soil and vegetation to slow decomposition sufficiently to allow return visits. However, cached carcasses are not always successfully recovered, either because the bear is interrupted, because another predator or scavenger locates and consumes the cache, or because the bear's ranging pattern takes it away from the cache location before it returns. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Abandoned caches represent genuinely unused food from the caching bear's perspective, though they function as significant resource patches for the scavengers and smaller predators that locate them. In ancient human contexts, following bears with the specific intention of locating cache sites was almost certainly a practiced strategy in areas where bears were common, and large prey was their primary food source. A cached ungulate that a bear has not returned to represents a substantial food resource for a human group capable of processing it quickly before further decomposition or competing scavengers consume it. The bear's relationship with fruit and berry food sources shows yet another dimension of what looks like waste but reflects a different kind of ecological optimization. Bears consuming berries and fruit eat in large quantities during berry season, consuming whole fruits including seeds, which pass through the digestive system largely intact and are deposited across the landscape in bear scat that functions as a seed dispersal mechanism for the fruit-producing plants. From the perspective of the berry plants, bears are a critical dispersal partner rather than a consumer depleting their reproduction. The seeds in bear scat are deposited with a nitrogen-rich fertilizer package that improves germination conditions, and they're distributed across large areas that the parent plant's own dispersal mechanisms couldn't reach. Bears consuming berries are being wasteful, in the sense that they eat far more berries than they can digest the seeds of, with seeds passing through and remaining viable. But from the plant's evolutionary perspective, this is exactly the service the plant needs bears to provide. The plant produces excess fruit beyond its caloric value to bears specifically to ensure that bears eat abundantly and distribute seeds widely, which is the ecological transaction that both species have co-evolved toward. Bears eating so many berries that they can't possibly extract all the nutritional value from each one are participating in a mutualism that benefits both parties in ways that become invisible if you only look at the caloric efficiency of the bear side of the equation. Ancient humans in berry-rich environments occupied a somewhat competitive position with bears for the same food resources, and the practical dynamics of this competition shaped ancient human foraging behavior around berry patches in regions where bears were common. Bears that have located productive berry patches defend them aggressively, particularly during hyperphagia when the stakes of food access are high. Ancient humans foraging in bear-active berry landscapes needed to maintain awareness of bear locations and activity patterns and to assess the risk of accessing specific patches at specific times. The accumulated practical knowledge of bear behavior, timing, and temperament that ancient groups maintained as part of their ecological knowledge base would have included specific knowledge about bear berry foraging patterns and how to safely access the same resources without direct confrontation. The actual quantity of food that bears consume and abandon during salmon season across the Pacific salmon run systems is ecologically significant enough to have been formally studied and modeled in terms of nutrient flows. In productive salmon stream systems with high bear densities during peak salmon runs, bears remove substantial proportions of the available salmon from the streams and deposit them across adjacent forests, with estimates in some systems suggesting bears transport hundreds of kilograms of marine-derived biomass per kilometer of stream into adjacent forest each season. The cumulative effect of this transport across entire watersheds and across the full duration of salmon runs over thousands of years, has shaped the composition and productivity of forest ecosystems in ways that would be measurably different without bear activity. The ecological term for what bears are doing in these systems is ecosystem engineering, the same term applied to beavers building dams, elephants modifying woodland structure, or any species whose activities substantially reshape the physical and chemical environment in ways that affect other species' resource availability. Bears engineering forest nutrient dynamics through selective salmon consumption and deposition is a form of ecosystem engineering that most people never consider when they observe what looks like a bear being profligate with its food. But that has been shaping temperate coastal forest ecosystems for as long as bears and salmon have coexisted in the same watersheds. The comparison with other large omnivores in terms of apparent food waste is instructive for understanding what's specifically distinctive about bear behavior. Wolves killing large ungulates typically consume a larger proportion of the carcass than bears consume of salmon during peak abundance. But wolves also create significant carcass remains that benefit ecosystem scavengers, ravens, eagles, foxes, and various others that are attracted to wolf kills. The wolf-scavenger community relationship is well documented and ecologically significant in systems where wolves are present. Bears at salmon streams create an analogous scavenger-community relationship, but at a dramatically different scale of food input, and at a more diffuse spatial distribution because bears carry fish throughout the forest rather than leaving carcasses at a single kill site. The cognitive dimension of what bears are doing during selective eating is worth considering because it relates to how we interpret the apparent waste. Bears do not appear to make calculated, conscious decisions about which fish parts to prioritize based on explicit fat content analysis. The behavioral pattern is driven by sensory preferences, taste and smell responses, that reflect evolutionary calibration toward the most nutritionally valuable parts of available food. A bear that preferentially bites into salmon eggs and skin before muscle is following sensory preferences that have been shaped by selection toward those preferences, because bears with stronger sensory preferences for fat-rich tissues accumulated fat more effectively and survived hibernation better over many generations. This taste preference-based optimization is actually more elegant than conscious calculation because it operates automatically without requiring cognitive processing of each decision. The bear does not need to think about which salmon part contains more fat. It simply prefers the taste of those parts strongly enough to seek them and leave the rest without needing to rationalize the decision. Natural selection has embedded the optimization in the sensory preferences themselves, producing the correct caloric behavior through taste rather than through calculation. Ancient humans observing bears repeatedly across generations would have accumulated practical knowledge about this preference pattern that was useful for their own food assessment in bear activity areas. Understanding that bears consistently abandoned specific fish parts provided information about which parts bears found most valuable, which was itself useful dietary information for human nutritional strategy. We've discussed across multiple earlier videos how ancient humans used animal behavior as an ecological information system, and the specific patterns of bear selective consumption provided dietary intelligence that informed ancient human choices about how to process their own food acquisitions. The hibernation cycle that drives hyperphagia and the dramatic food consumption patterns of late summer and fall creates a seasonal rhythm of bear food interaction that ancient humans in bear range areas would have tracked and incorporated into their own seasonal activity planning. Bear active season and productive feeding areas corresponded with specific high-value food availability, salmon runs, berry seasons, ungulate vulnerability patterns, and ancient humans whose territories overlapped with bears developed sophisticated knowledge of these seasonal patterns, both because the resources bears were accessing were also resources they were interested in, and because predicting bear activity patterns helped them manage the risk of bear encounters during their own food acquisition activities. The practical relationship between ancient humans and bears in shared landscapes was complex, involving competition for some resources, opportunistic scavenging of bear-modified resources, risk management around bear encounters, and the specific ecological knowledge that long-term coexistence in the same landscape produced. Bears were neither prey that ancient humans systematically hunted, given the risk and difficulty of bear hunting, nor predators that ancient humans lived in simple fear of, though individual bear encounters were dangerous. They were ecological neighbors whose activities created resource opportunities, whose behavioral patterns provided information, and whose presence required sophisticated management through knowledge of their behavior, habitat use, and temporal patterns. The question this video started with, why do bears waste so much food, resolves at multiple levels simultaneously. At the individual bear level, the behavior that looks like waste is caloric optimization during a time-limited window of abundance, prioritizing rate of fat accumulation over completeness of individual food item utilization. At the ecosystem level, it's nutrient redistribution that benefits forest productivity, scavenger communities, and ecosystem diversity in ways that make calling it waste ecologically inaccurate. At the evolutionary level, it reflects selection pressures calibrated across millions of years of bear evolution in seasonal environments, where maximizing fat accumulation before winter mattered more than finishing every fish. And at the ancient human interaction level, it created resource opportunities and information systems that ancient people embedded in the same landscapes exploited and learned from across generations of coexistence. Bears don't waste food. They redistribute it through ecosystems in specific ways that reflect their evolutionary priorities, their physiological state, and their caloric optimization strategies in ways that benefit everything downstream in both the literal and ecological senses. The salmon carcasses on the riverbank that a bear considers finished with are projects barely started for the ravens, the eagles, the smaller mammals, the insects, and eventually the forest soil and vegetation that will incorporate those marine nutrients into temperate forest ecosystems where they'll influence tree growth for decades. The bear has done its part. Everyone else picks up from there.